Eleanor, a girl about to marry Ethan, is kidnapped by Scott, a taxi driver right before the wedding. Scott reveals the truth that Ethan is cheating on Eleanor with Charlotte, a rich girl. Eleanor was heartbroken, but later realized Scott's sincere feelings and agreed to marry him. Ethan and Charlotte receive consequences for their betrayal. Let's start the story. Eleanor woke up in a happy mood because today her dream would come true, and she would become Ethan's wife. Eleanor has loved Ethan since high school, and it's no surprise because Ethan is always the soul of every party, easily capturing the hearts of girls. At school, all the girls dream about him, including Eleanor. Even though Ethan came from a simple family, he was always sociable and respected by everyone. Eleanor also did not come from a wealthy family, but as an only child, she had an easier life than Ethan. The only person in the family who worked was his father. Eleanor's parents both worked, and she never lacked for anything. Whatever the girls' reasons were, it was Eleanor who captured Ethan's heart. They dated for a while, then decided to get married. When Eleanor announced this decision, her parents were dissatisfied but did not intervene, because they believed that their daughter was an adult and had the right to decide her own life. As savvy parents, they shouldered all the wedding expenses, knowing that Ethan and his family couldn't do it. The morning of the wedding, Eleanor went to see her stylist for her hair and makeup. She stayed there longer than planned, and on the way back, she was in a hurry because there were only 2 hours left until the celebration started. Eleanor got into the first taxi that stopped. A few minutes later, the driver, a young man, looked in the rearview mirror and said his name was Scott and she shouldn't worry. He wouldn't hurt her but just needed to talk. Eleanor was very scared and tried to open the door but was blocked. She tried to convince Scott to release her, or at least let her call, but to no avail. Scott stubbornly drove to the outskirts of the city. Coming to a small house, buried in a bush of wild grapes, he invited Eleanor in to drink tea and talk. Eleanor panicked and begged Scott to let her go because the wedding was about to start, and the groom was anxiously looking for her. Scott angrily said there was no groom because he betrayed her with a rich woman. Eleanor was stunned and confused, but Scott said if she wanted to know the truth about Ethan, he would tell. Scott begins the story about his difficult childhood, when his parents were often drunk and he was placed in an orphanage. Scott didn't like it there and often ran away. One time, he saw gangsters hurting an old man and rushed to protect him. The old man, named Bailey, invited Scott to his house, and they became friends. Scott considered Mr. Bennett like a grandfather and often visited, even staying overnight. One day, Scott saw that Charlotte, the landlord's daughter, was extremely beautiful, and he immediately fell in love with her. Even though he knew Charlotte might not pay attention to him, Scott still secretly loved her. Mr. Bennett, however, finds Charlotte spoiled and has an obnoxious personality, which Scott cannot believe. Eleanor listened to Scott's story and began to feel suspicious about Ethan. She wondered whether she should trust Scott or not. In her heart, love for Ethan was still strong, but the appearance of Scott and his story shook her faith. He thinks the old man has forgotten, with age, what love means. One day, Charlotte came up to Scott and asked his name. While Scott stammered with excitement trying to answer the girl's questions, she lost interest in him and ordered fresh roses cut for her birthday. Her parents arranged a wonderful party for Charlotte with tables on the lawn, filled with food and gifts, bright lights everywhere, music and laughter. Scott watched the party from a hidden corner of the garden, dreaming that Charlotte would remember and invite him, but that didn't happen. Years passed. Scott grew up, served in the army, and after his discharge he immediately visited Mr. Bennett. The old man was very happy and they chatted for a long time. Scott had earned his driver's license in the army, and Mr. Bennett offered to talk to his employer about a driving job. Scott began working as a driver for Charlotte's family and soon met her again. The girl became a wonderful beauty, but Charlotte did not recognize Scott and even showed contempt for him. One day, Scott dared to confess his feelings to Charlotte, but she just laughed in his face. However, Scott decided to wait until she understood that no one loved her as much as he did. Meanwhile, Charlotte enjoys life and doesn't need anyone. She was used to being liked by everyone, and was surprised to meet a guy at the club who didn't notice her irritation. When she saw him walking with another girl, Charlotte got angry and vowed to have him, no matter the cost. Charlotte soon got what she wanted, and they started dating. One day, Charlotte did not hesitate to attack this guy right in the back seat of the car. Scott felt disgusted and stopped the car, leaving them alone. Eleanor didn't understand what Scott was getting at until he said that Charlotte's boyfriend was Ethan. But the worst part is that Scott dropped Charlotte and Ethan off a few days ago and heard Charlotte say she wanted to marry him. Ethan promised that he would inform his fiancée that there would be no wedding. Charlotte disagreed and asked Ethan to leave the bride on the wedding day, and when Eleanor cried among the guests, Ethan and Charlotte flew to Miami. Although Ethan didn't like the idea, Charlotte gave him an ultimatum, forcing him to agree. Scott finished the story, placed a cup of coffee in front of a shocked Eleanor, and said that he brought her here to tell everything in a quiet atmosphere because he did not want a good girl to be treated unfairly. Eleanor calls her father and discovers that Ethan has not yet come to the wedding. Eleanor clearly realizes that all this time, she's been blindly in love with Ethan and did not realize what he really was. She reassured her worried father, said she would be home soon, and hung up. Eleanor asked God to take her home to explain to her parents and predicted that there would be no wedding. But then Scott looked at her lovingly and said she could do it differently. Obviously, fate brought them together, and if Eleanor agreed to stay with him in this house, to be his wife, he would do everything so that she would never regret it. Eleanor, surprising herself, smiled and agreed. They got in the car and left quickly because there wasn't much time left before the wedding. On the way, Eleanor called her father and said that Ethan had changed his mind about getting married, and that the wedding would not take place. She also asked someone to pick up Mr. Bennett, because he was the only person close to her ex-fiancé. A few hours later, the newlyweds, Scott and Eleanor, were happily married. The guests looked at them tenderly. Eleanor's parents were surprised because they had never heard of Scott, but immediately liked him for his kindness and simplicity. When Mr. Bennett came to the microphone, congratulated the young couple, and told a touching story about his friendship with Scott, many guests could not hold back their tears. The old man wished the newlyweds happiness and a lifetime together. The party was in full swing when suddenly Ethan appeared. Everyone was silent and watched what would happen. Ethan was surprised to see that his bride did not sob, but quickly found a new groom. Eleanor giggled and asked why Ethan wasn't in Miami on the beach with Charlotte, but it turned out that Charlotte had been teasing him and Ethan thought that maybe there was still time for his wedding to Eleanor. Scott quickly makes it clear that a traitor like Ethan has no place here. Ethan sadly leaves, knowing that he has lost everything and not knowing if he can find happiness again. Charlotte is also not happy at all. She laughed at Ethan, flew to Miami to marry a handsome Italian guy, but suddenly discovered she was pregnant with Ethan's child. She didn't know what to do. Her marriage fell apart because of Ethan, and she didn't understand why she was having these problems. The story we just heard contains many unexpected details and profound lessons about love, loyalty, betrayal, and forgiveness. About Eleanor. I find Eleanor to be an admirable girl. She is strong, resilient, and knows how to overcome adversity. Initially, Eleanor seemed blindly in love with Ethan, but when the truth was revealed, she bravely faced it and made the right decision. The fact that she chose Scott, who had always loved and protected her, showed that Eleanor appreciated true values. About Scott. He is a kind, sincere, and loyal guy. An unhappy childhood did not make him negative. On the contrary, he always yearned for love and sharing. Scott's love for Eleanor is admirable. He patiently waits and protects her, regardless of the difference in social status. About Ethan. He is a traitor, greedy and cowardly. Ethan is blinded by money and status, willing to betray his love to pursue frivolous things. In the end, he paid a heavy price for his mistakes. About Charlotte. She is a selfish, overbearing girl who always wants to control others. Charlotte does not know how to appreciate true love and only cares about satisfying her own desires. She single-handedly destroyed her own happiness. Lesson: the story reminds us that true love is not blindness, but understanding, respect, and sharing. At the same time, it also warns about the consequences of betrayal, greed, and selfishness. Ultimately, the story also brings a positive message about forgiveness and the ability to find new happiness after breakups.